Ladies and gentlemen, let's gaming today.com video. We're going to be talking about the PlayStation 4 Neo, which is the code name for the PlayStation 4K, also known as the PlayStation 4.5. A whole bunch of you have been asking my thoughts and opinions on this one because we have a whole bunch of information. We have information regarding to the specifications of the machine, how Sony are going to ensure developers utilize the system but not be unfair to original owners, and a lot more besides. So we're just going to jump into this one. There's also an article, by the way, which is linked in the video description if you prefer a written version of an analysis. But with that said, we're going to go straight into it. I'm going to give a quick overview of the specifications, and then we're going to start drilling down more into the specifics. So let's begin. First things first, CPU. It is still using the Jaguar core, although I have a few additions to that, and we'll go into those in just a second. But the Jaguar cores, there's still 8 of them. They're running at 2.1 GHz. That's a 500 MHz increase, or 30%. It has 18 compute units running at 911 MHz, which is providing a 2.27 times the performance of the vanilla machine if you're just talking about the GPU. And finally, memory performance, you're looking at 218 gigabytes per second compared to the vanilla/base unit of 176 gigabytes per second. And there is also additional memory available for games. But, and I emphasize the word but, there is not extra memory installed in the machine. There's just an extra allocation available for games. So let's begin, shall we? Because there's a whole bunch of stuff to get through, so I guess the main thing to start with are the compute units, the GCN units. So the source is supposedly citing it as an improved GCN architecture, and honestly speaking, there's no way this is not Polaris. Now, a couple of people are going to probably question why I'm so sure about that. Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, I've already done a report on a leak, actually, from a Polaris GPU just a few days ago, and that actually had 36 compute units. This is a Polaris 10 GPU. The model is 67DF:C4, and as I said, has 64 compute units, although the this version is probably going to have slightly higher clock speeds for the desktop compared to the PS4. The second reason we can be pretty darn certain it's Polaris is because the NX has multiple rumours concerning it using Polaris, and therefore if it's using Polaris, Sony are going to use Polaris because the two architectures are completely backwardly compatible. And third reason is it's also 2 times to 2.5 times improvement performance per watt, which basically means that in layman's terms, if you put in 1 watt of energy with Polaris, you get over twice the performance compared to the older 28nm GPUs, which basically the whole thing just makes a whole bunch of sense. Now, a couple of extra tidbits regarding Polaris. While we have a 4.2 T-flops of computing performance, that's compared to 1.84 of the base PS4, there are a couple of extras with Polaris. The first is you've got improvements with memory compression, which basically means that the data inside the GPU is squeezed down. It's lossless compression. This essentially means that you don't need as much memory bandwidth to move the same amount of data. This was first introduced back in Tonga, which is the same GPU that started in the R9 285 and as such has also emigrated into, I believe, the Fury lineup. And now Polaris is taking that one step further, which means it's got considerable improvements over memory bandwidth. For your information, the Tonga architecture offered about a 40% improvement memory bandwidth, memory compression. We're unsure what Polaris offers. The reason I say unsure is because they've just said it's an improvement, and by they I mean AMD, but we don't know how much of an improvement. But there are certainly other additions as well. For example, there's primitive discard accelerator. This essentially tests the scene very early in the setup of the scene. Every time a frame of animation on screen is displayed, the GPU goes through multiple pipeline stages, vastly simplifying this. But one of the very first is primitive It's basically just the rough sketch, if you will, of the scene, and then after a certain amount of time it will start going through geometry processing, which is basically adding lots of extra detail. Then you start having textures applied, lighting, and all of the other stuff, which makes the scene look shiny. Essentially speaking, the further you go along this pipeline before you eliminate excess waste, for example, let's say, and I always use this example, you've got a car which is being partially blocked by a wall. If the GPU doesn't realize until like 90% through the rendering process that that car is 50% invisible, it's 50% blocked by the wall, you've just basically wasted that performance. I've heard multiple numbers touted around for primitive discard, but some of the numbers I've heard is about a 20% improvement from it alone. So basically with that, plus improved scheduling across the units, for example, the Polaris has added such things such as instruction prefetch, which basically means that the GPU's fetching instructions before the other ones are finished processing. So let's say it's fetching instruction 2 while it's processing instruction 1, which means you get less latency. You've got improved shader efficiency, which is pretty obvious, and you've also got things such as hardware scheduler. Rather than having the software, the CPU, schedule workloads across the GPU can do it itself, and it's more efficient, and it once again reduces latency, and it also improves utilization across all of those shader cores, because now the PlayStation 4 is going from 1152 all the way up to 2304. It's a massive increase. Now, what else? What else do we know? Well, apart from the GPU side of things, in terms of the very basic specifications, it would appear that Sony are opting to keep with Jaguar. So Jaguar, just to give you a quick rundown, on the vanilla PS4 is running at 1.6 gigahertz. That's been pretty much confirmed at this point. The Xbox One version was running at 1.75 gigahertz, and there's always been room left in the tank. Now, the reason I'm a bit uncertain whether it is exactly Jaguar or perhaps a slight successor known as Puma is because it's a very slight evolution of Jaguar. Puma isn't really a redo of Jaguar in so much as it's just a more power efficient version. For example, one of AMD's own slides of this is you can increase the frequency by 50% for only half the TDP of the previous generation, which in this case would be Jaguar. There's not really improvements, however, to the performance at large. So, for example, there's not major improvements to IPC, also known as instruction per clock, or if you prefer, the amount of work that the CPU can do per clock. Instead, it's more power efficiency. You've got less voltage leaking, that type of stuff. It's possible that they are still keeping with Jaguar, but they've basically just tweaked Jaguar and they've gotten so damn good at producing Jaguar, maybe once again on a 14nm process by now. But at 2.1 gigahertz, it's quite an increase. You're looking at about 30% improvement over the vanilla PS4. Now, you might say to yourself, well, the original PS4 CPU has actually been called quite slow. And that's by multiple developers. In fact, folks even over at Sucker Punch, folks even at Naughty Dog have said one of the big problems with the PS4 is parallelizing, that's a bit of a mouthful to say, lots of work across the CPU. There are 8 Jaguar cores inside the PlayStation 4, and this is the same whether we're talking about the Neo or the vanilla machine. But 6 of those are always available to games developers, while the 7th, a portion of it is available to games developers. How much of that portion really depends, but figures are touted between 50 to 80% of the 7th CPU core. Regardless of all of that, however, an increase in clock speed in this situation means that you're going to get game logic running smoother, which would be things such as physics, it could be artificial intelligence, and other things which aren't really for the GPU to handle. On top of that, of course, the GPU is also able to be issued more commands. Now, one of the real, I guess you could say, sticking points for this is you might say, well, how does that even work? You've got a GPU which is like 2.25 to 2.27 if you want me to be exact, times more powerful, but the CPU is only 30% more powerful. What gives? Why? Well, in a nutshell, it's all about resolution and all about what Sony are aiming for. I'm going to make the assumption that their internal testings have told them that most developers, and most of the time, they're going to want to aim for high resolutions. Remember that just cranking up resolution alone can be a massive, 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 massive increase in workload on the GPU. How much of a difference? Well, quite a lot. For example, just going from 900p to, let's say, 1080p is asking for 44% more pixels on screen, which is gargantuan. If you're going to from 1080p to 1440p, you're looking at 1.78 times the amount of pixels on screen, 78% more pixels just from going from 1080p to 1440p. So you can see how it doesn't really take much to start blowing a lot of the GPU's budget just simply by increasing the resolution. Sony have said that they don't necessarily expect developers to hit 4K, and this is why. You might say, well, 2.27 times the performance is an awful lot. Well, it is, but remember 4K compared to 1080p is 4 times the workload on the GPU, and when you start taking into account frame rate as well, remember, frame rate is all about time to render an image on screen. While you might not think of it when you're shooting someone in Doom, every frame of animation is individual. So let's say you're getting 30 frames per second in your game, that means the whole system has 33.3 milliseconds to render those 30 frames a second. That's 33.3 milliseconds for each frame of animation. If you're aiming at 60 frames per second, on the other hand, it becomes just 16.6 milliseconds, which is half the amount of time, which is why I'm saying that performance can get eaten alive really, really, really quickly when it comes to the CPU and GPU. So I think just that increase makes a lot of sense. There was talk that AMD were going to go with Zen. Sony were going to go with Zen, which is AMD's upcoming architecture. There's a couple of theories I've got for why they haven't. One, pricing. Supposedly the price of the Neo was either going to be $399 or $499. $499 was a drastically improved CPU. I'm going to guess that Sony did some internal soul searching and said, well, there's no way in balls that a gamer is going to want to pay what is essentially getting up to $1,000 for a virtual reality. Let's say if you're buying the PS4K and you're also buying PSVR, it's a lot of money. When you start getting to like the 400 to 500 range, that's a lot of money to ask for folks to fork out for, especially if they've already got the base machine. So that's why I'm guessing they're not going with Zen, and that's why I'm going to assume they're going to keep with Jaguar. Now, what about the memory? So, as I said, there's 218 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. And this compares to the vanilla machine. The vanilla machine, for your FYI, has 176 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. So, how have Sony achieved this? Well, there's a couple of potential configurations. Configuration A, the one that I believe is unlikely, is 5500 MHz GDDR5 on a 320-bit memory bus. Very unlikely. It doesn't make sense because Polaris is 256-bit natively. The APU they've already put together for the PS4, which I'm assuming this is going to be an evolution of that, is 256-bit. Doesn't make sense, therefore that option is probably out. Therefore the logical option is a 256-bit bus with much faster memory, 6800 MHz. Now, Sony technically could go with 7000 MHz memory, which puts them at around 220 gigabytes per second, but they've probably opted to go with 6800, and the reason behind that is likely yields. Basically, they're probably thinking to themselves that they can get some 7000 megahertz DIMMs that just couldn't quite make that speed, and they might be able to cut themselves a deal. That's a guess. Now, what we do know is the PS4, the vanilla PS4, had a memory bandwidth of around 20 gigabytes per second when it comes to the CPU. That's how much bandwidth the CPU out of the 176 has access to it. Now, we know this for two reasons. One, it's what the Xbox One had, because remember the Xbox One's SDK leaked and they had a complete system diagram. And remember, the Xbox One CPU is faster than the PlayStation 4's, therefore it wouldn't make sense for the PlayStation 4's to be higher, the bandwidth to be higher than the Xbox One CPU, because it doesn't need it, it's only a CPU. The second reason, and this one's even more solid, is that a couple of developers from Sony's own team have actually confirmed the bandwidth requirements, or rather available bandwidth for the Jaguar. So what we can assume is, even if we were to linearly scale the bandwidth up by 30%, you're still only looking at around the 24 to 26 gigabytes per second taken up by the CPU. It probably doesn't actually need that, to be honest with you. That's probably being pretty generous, 20 gigabytes per second, but even so. Now, you're going to immediately say, well, gee, okay, that leaves you just under 200 gigabytes for the rest of the system, and obviously the GPU is going to be the thing that hoovers up most of the bandwidth. Is it possible that Sony have underestimated how much bandwidth the GPU is going to take? Honestly, I think it's probably going to be fine. And I'd actually done maths previously, and folks who have seen my NX analysis, as well as my earlier PS4 analysis when we first started to get the rumours for this, knows that I actually predicted very low 200 gigabytes. I thought 200 to 240 at pure maximum. And I kind of gathered around 224 would be the sweet spot. Why? Because A, costing. Well, once again, 7 gigahertz chips are readily available. 2, with Polaris, once again, we're seeing, let's say the PS4's GPU, the vanilla PS4's GPU has access to about 150 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. I'm rounding it up here. Well, what you can do is, if you were to say that this was on the Polaris, so once again, same GPU performance, 1.84 teraflops of performance, but it was on Polaris, assuming that Polaris is only 10% more memory efficient than Tonga, you're still only meaning that you're going to need 92 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth to feed the GPU compared to 150. So that's why I'm saying that memory bandwidth not really super big problem for the PS4 Neo. I'm going to say that Sony have been pretty much okay with it, and these specifications also fall perfectly in line with what we've heard with Polaris's own specifications with the Polaris 10 in terms of how much memory bandwidth is available. So even taking into account that in this case it has to feed the sound processor, it has to feed the rest of the North Bridge, the pretty much everything, including the CPU and all of that crap. It's absolutely fine. I don't really think that memory bandwidth is going to be a problem for the system. It's probably going to be absolutely hunky and dory. Last thing I want to talk about on the same subject of memory is available memory. So the PlayStation 4, the vanilla regular model, has 8 gigabytes of memory, which is painfully obvious to everyone at this point, with 4.5 gigabytes available for games developers that they control, and a further 512 megabytes of flexible memory. So what the hell does that mean? Well, essentially it means that with the 4.5 gigabytes they can do whatever they want with that memory. They could put in 4.2 gigabytes of textures if they wanted, or they could put in 3 gigabytes of sound, and the rest of it could be, game logic. It's completely up to them. I'm just being absolutely silly now, but you get the idea. Flexible memory, however, isn't so much with the flexible. Flexible memory is basically controlled by the PlayStation 4 on behalf of the game. You can think of it almost like a swap file. So developers don't control it, but some of the game's core logic is run on that. So it could be, for example, cache, it could be some game code, whatever the whatever the operating system feels is best to throw into that. So once again, just to go over that, so we're all clear, 4.5 gigabytes available to developers and a 512 megabyte extra, which the OS controls on behalf of the game. So for all intents and purposes, 5 gigabytes is available to the game. Neo will increase this by another 512 megabytes, which presumably means that you're going to have 5 gigabytes controllable for the developers and a further 512 megabytes which is flexible, which means you've got 5.5 gigabytes. Hopefully that makes sense. So this means as well that starting in October, every PlayStation 4 game released will have 2 modes. So as the game boots, it has to say vanilla or it has to say Neo. Vanilla mode is pretty obvious. It means that the PlayStation 4 will act like, or rather the game will act like it's running in a vanilla regular machine, the one you've got sitting under your cabinet right now. On the other hand, Neo mode will give the software access to the additional hardware resources. So in this case, it will give it access to the additional memory, it will give it access to the additional CPU power, the additional GPU power, and so on and so forth. Makes a whole lot of sense, right? Okay, so what else? I mentioned already that Sony do not necessarily expect developers to push 4K. They do. You know, it would be nice in certain games. I have a feeling that some walking simulators, some slower paced titles would potentially support 4K, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some titles running at, let's say, 1440p or maybe 1200p or what have you, you know, basically higher than 1080. The other thing is that Sony are being adamant developers cannot run at frame rates which are lower than the base machine. So in this case, let's say Sony, let's say a developer hardlocks a game at 30 FPS on the vanilla system, it can't go at 27, 28 frames a second on the 4K if they're pushing for high resolution. Sony will not accept that. The performance has to match or beat it with better graphics, which kind of makes sense because I think otherwise you as a gamer would be pretty pissed. So what happens if you pop your old game into the PS4? Okay. What happens if you put in, say, Killzone Shadowfall? What happens if you put in GTA? Simple. Nothing. It will run exactly how it does in your current system. There is no difference whatsoever unless a developer decides to put out a patch. If a developer decides to put out a patch, which is obviously the onus is on them, so you're not going to force them to do this, then the patch will essentially give the game access to higher rendering resolutions, which, to be fair, probably wouldn't be very difficult for a lot of developers to do, but it would of course depend on the game engine and how the game was put together. What else? Well, Sony are also not allowing developers to add modes or add features which were not available in the regular mode. So, regular PS4. So, for the sake of argument, you won't get level editors. You won't get split screen, co-op on the Neo. You won't get what is, I guess you could say, a different gaming experience. The main difference is going to be frame rate or resolution or level of detail. I can understand, however, the PlayStation VR is going to benefit the most from this. The PSVR display is just 1080p, that's 960 by 1080 per eye, but because developers have to basically adhere to that resolution and adhere to a higher frame rate, that means that level of detail, texture quality, lighting quality, what have you, is probably going to suffer for certain VR games. Now, with the Neo, if you're once again running a Neo system, you should theoretically have access to higher level of detail, maybe more smooth frame rates, maybe lower latency, whatever they manage to do. It's going to be quite interesting. Finally, I want to finish this fairly lengthy video off actually with my thoughts on this whole situation. So there's also some reports regarding the Xbox and its upgraded hardware, which is going to be a separate video from this because I could talk about that for quite a lengthy period of time as well. And Microsoft rumours have actually just popped up today, so I'll go into those. If I've got time, I'll make the video. I don't want to promise, otherwise it's going to slip till tomorrow. But regarding the PS4, I don't know how I feel about this. I'm in two minds. In a way, I'm actually happy about it. I think it's a good thing. But in another way, I think it's a bad thing. I know that actually makes no sense, but hear me out. So the good news is that it means that you're going to have access to better graphics. It means you're going to have access to theoretically better experiences. It means the games are going to look better. And as a PC gamer primarily, I'm not an Xbox gamer, I'm not a PS4 gamer, I own all systems, but I'm primarily a PC gamer. Why? Because I prefer the graphics, I prefer, just for me, the fact that I've always got my PC on, it's just a double click of an exe file and I'm good to go. It's just how I personally have grown up to play. But for me, it's also good because the graphics are going to move on for PC as well, because the consoles essentially are holding PC back. You might get upset about that, but it's true. If you don't believe me, look at SVOGI. One of the reasons that it was kind of removed for Unreal Engine initially was because the consoles just couldn't handle it. And the story goes, Epic Games actually believed that the PS4 and Xbox One were going to be faster than what they ended up being. And this is not the only story. We're already seeing games now being downgraded. Look at Watch Dogs, and it's not the only instance. Watch Dogs was famously downgraded because of visual parity. So that's good. Better graphics is good. Better gameplay is good. My concern, though, is it's also a lot of money. And asking, what is a lot of money for only roughly twice the performance? A bit difficult to swallow, because here's what I would have preferred, personally. If the PS4K is released this year, and remember this is not official confirmation, but the reports are saying it will be. They're basically saying it's going to be released about Christmas-ish. I would have personally preferred it to be delayed another, let's say, 6 to 9 months. So, for sake of argument, let's say October-ish next year. And they called it instead the PlayStation 5. And what they would do is full backwards compatibility. The GPU would be, let's say, 3 times faster than the vanilla PS4. They released it at a slightly lower price point because by then Polaris and 14nm and all of the other components would be cheaper. They could put in a better CPU and they wouldn't need to worry about running native PS4 games, or rather Neo games, on the PS4. They could basically say, hey, if you don't want to upgrade, that's cool, but there's a separation basically of church and state. Now that might upset some users, but I think that would be, in my opinion, the better way to handle it. And it would also help to spread out the cost for a lot of folks. Now, if you're super rich, you probably don't care about that. But I'm still thinking that 2 to 2.27, excuse me, times the performance. It's great, and definitely is going to make the difference, but I would have preferred, let's even say it's 2.5 times the performance, including all of the efficiencies of Polaris. Let's say it's 2.5 times the performance. That's pretty good, but if they'd have waited another year, that might have gone to 3 to 3.5. And it's not like Sony are in a bad position in the market. That's the thing. So even if the NX turned out to be considerably more powerful, they're not suddenly going to lose market share. So personally, and this is based upon these rumours, this is based upon me not using the machine, this is based on no official confirmation, this is based upon not seeing any of their titles, this is based on purely what I'm hearing, my initial thoughts. I would have preferred to see this in 12 months later, for it to be called the PlayStation 5, and to basically have a 4-year console cycle. I would have personally preferred that. Or another option is it's once again released in next year, but then you have a hardware upgrade available in 2 years after that. So the PlayStation 5 comes out, 2 years after that, there's an upgrade slot in the PlayStation 5. You can put your upgraded hardware in, and that would increase the PS5's performance by, let's say, another 50%. That could be another way to do it. Give me your thoughts and opinions on this one, folks. Like, will you buy it? Because I've been reading on various forums over the last, I don't know, couple of hours during my lunch break at work, and just generally speaking on the commute home, and I'm kind of hearing mixed things. Like, some people are absolutely loving it, some people are like, yeah, this is the greatest thing ever, And other people are pissed because they've said, well, I bought the PlayStation 4, I didn't want to do basically a half upgrade. And others saying, that's fine, I'll just keep with the vanilla machine, but for better graphics, I'm just going to upgrade my PC. Or I'll just see what happens with the NX or what have you. Let me know your thoughts on this one. Kind of curious. But there you have it, folks. The PS4 Neo. If you can like, subscribe, share, give me internet cookies, that would be greatly appreciated. But for now, I'll leave you to it. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.